Welcome to this episode of Rather Than the Bars. Um, Recently, last April, in Annapolis, a bill got passed about juvenile lifers in the state of Maryland. And so joining me to give us an update on that and the history behind it is ACLU lawyer Sonia Kamara. Sonia, thanks for joining me again.
Thank you for having me.
Talk about this. I know you've been working in this field for years. Talk about the history behind this effort, the court challenge, as well as the legislation. Can you just give us an overview what happened here in the state of Maryland?
Sure. So where to begin? So Maryland is one of only 3 states in the country where if you are serving a life sentence, in order to be released, the governor must personally approve your release. And in the mid-1990s, Maryland's then governor announced at the height of the tough on crime era that he wasn't going to parole any lifers. And his statement that day, because other governors that succeeded him followed suit, functionally abolished parole for people serving life sentences in Maryland, including those who were kids at the time of their crime. So lifers and their families and their loved ones organized for years and years to try to restore some kind of opportunity for release and parole, and were largely unsuccessful because it's not a politically popular position. And in the course of learning about that, sort of 20 years or so, 25 years after those decisions of the Maryland governor and the governors following suit, there were a series of decisions at the U.S. Supreme Court that created a new opening to challenge that practice. And those cases at the Supreme Court said essentially that when it comes to imposing our harshest punishments, we have to recognize that children are different from their adult counterparts, and they're different because their brains are still developing. They're different because they're not in control of their environments. They're seeking approval from their peers. It's all of the same reasons why we wait until you're 21 to let you get a liquor. Organizing in conjunction with a lot of the lifer community around the state, we brought a lawsuit arguing that Maryland had functionally abolished its parole system, and at least as to those who were children at the time of their crime, that violated the Eighth Amendment. The state had basically taken their sentences and converted them to life without parole, and instead of a parole system, it was operating a system of clemency. And I think it's important to understand that close to 85% of Maryland's juvenile lifer population is Black. There were hundreds of people who were primarily Black boys who were penalized by this system, although it was, of course, also included women and others. And so there were several people who sort of came forward and put their personal stories out there in order to pursue this litigation. And then at the same time, there were other court challenges. There were court challenges brought by the Maryland Office of the Public Defender in the state courts, raising these same issues. And what we saw was sort of this building of momentum and a movement to help Maryland's juvenile lifers finally get a meaningful opportunity to come home. Litigation is always just part of the answer. Over the course of the last few years, the campaign for the fair sentencing of youth started becoming more active right here in Maryland. And I think really building on all of the work that, Maryland's juvenile lifer community had been doing, helped push forward legislation that essentially sought to say, we're going to do a look back in the courts for people who are serving long sentences, who were sentenced for crimes they committed as children. And it was a very heated issue, and in a lot of ways I think it really brings up the same old tropes that were really popular in the 80s and 90s about dangerous young Black men, and protecting white suburban communities from these dangerous young Black men, and really trotting out, I think the opponents of this effort really tried to trot out victims to oppose these changes. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, it's not lost on me or anyone who has, I think, harmed anyone else, that we're often talking about really serious violations of others, right? We're talking about serious harms. And what we've seen is that in a lot of instances, sort of white victim communities in particular are brought out and to make public statements in opposition of changes that would restore second chances, for example. What we've also seen, though, is that those people are often also being used by public officials who have their own agenda. So during the legislative process, there were victims who came forward and said, they don't speak for me. I believe in a second chance. One of the survivors of the Malvo case told legislators, I support this legislation. But those voices are marginalized and discounted because it doesn't serve the dominant narrative, right? So it's an incredible success. It was an incredible success that through this sustained campaign, legislators passed the bill to establish a right to go back to court after you've served 20 years. Actually, the Maryland's governor vetoed the legislation almost immediately, and cited sort of much of the same rhetoric of white prosecutors from the most conservative parts of our state in doing so. But fortunately, that veto happened during the legislative session, and so Maryland's legislature actually overrode the governor's veto. So that law is going into effect this October. And our understanding is that Maryland's Office of the Public Defender is really taking the lead in organizing to ensure that all of the people who are eligible have the benefit of lawyers to assist them in taking advantage of this new law.
Okay, that's a plus. Is this something that other states can learn from? Or as you say, this was unique in the sense that there's only 3 states that had the governor imposed against the parole system?
I think I don't think that it is that unique. I think, Maryland's unique in that that's our particular failure. I should also acknowledge that this year we also passed legislation to remove the governor from the parole process. He vetoed it. We're going back for an override next January. But I think, it is often the case that there's resistance. Every state is in one way or another paying the price for its tough, very racist, tough on crime mentality from the 80s and 90s in particular. And so I think there are different iterations of the same problem in different jurisdictions. I think it was Maryland is absolutely not alone. So, for example, in the District of Columbia, they not only passed legislation like this several years back, but they've actually gone back in and expanded it to address emerging adults, the people who were not quite technically minors in the eyes of the law, but for whom a lot of the brain science and the rationale still applies. So I think that, we're hopeful that this is a sort of one point in the ongoing movement that we hope will extend across the country. But Maryland is not the first, and we're certainly hopeful that we won't be the last.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now you're saying October the 1st, any person that was sentenced to juvenile life uh, now will be eligible to go back to court. And you're saying that there's uh, a group of lawyers out there that's taking the lead. Tell us what are they doing? Are they in touch now or what?
Yeah, good question. So it's not limited to those who were sentenced to life. It applies to people who are serving long sentences, not just those with the L. I think what is
Oh,
you
okay.
know what has been the there, as you can maybe tell, over the years, there's been a really significant growth in the number of people, including lawyers, who care about getting justice for Maryland's juvenile lifers. And so the Maryland Office of the Public Defender has formed a new initiative. I believe they're calling it their decarceration initiative. And the they have sent out questionnaires uh, to made contact with people who they believe are eligible already for the relief come October 1st. I mean, of course, this is something that's going to, because it's based on the amount of time you serve, it's going to continue growing, right? As time passes, more and more people will reach that eligibility time frame. There's an effort to, ensure that both that lawyers are recruited to with the training of the Office of the Public Defender and support of all kinds of different advocacy groups, able to provide really sort of high quality, individualized assistance to people who are eligible. And so there's a very active recruitment effort going on as we speak. And that's I think one wrinkle in all of this is obviously that we have been living through a global pandemic, and that courts around the state are enormously backed up and are only just resuming trials in a bunch of our jurisdictions. And so I think one important caution is that some of this is really going to take time. In terms of what I think folks can be doing to help their own situations, one critically important thing is you know so much of how you fare is based on what you've been able to show about what you've been doing with your time, and making sure that you have your documentation, and making sure that there are, to the extent possible, people on the outside who can help you. And I think that's a really important point that I want to just acknowledge, is that if people really are sort of going up, I hope they are able to recognize that they have agency in terms of helping prepare themselves. And our hope is that there will be more and more forums where, in particular, family members and others can be engaging with each other about how to live through this process and be supported in the best way possible.
Okay. And so the main thing is, like you say, they have agency and they need to be patient.
Yes.
And certainly the support of their family to help do this. So I mean that's good, because that's hopeful. Um,
Yeah. The juvenile lifer lawsuit that I referenced, it was called MRJI v. Hogan, settled earlier this year. And through the settlement, the juvenile lifers involved negotiated some really significant changes to the process, both in terms of sort of how the Maryland Parole Commission handles cases, some of the practices of the DOC, and some greater transparency for the governor until he's hopefully legislatively removed from the process. And I think one of the other things that I hope people will continue to focus on is also continuing to pursue parole. I think, for so long, for understandable reasons, lifers have felt like it's futile. Our hope is to help people get as ready as possible to be in the queue for when the governor is removed. Not everybody's going to get out through the courts. There's going to be there's already a lot of opposition organizing. And so we really hope that people will continue engaging with the parole process, so that we can get to the point where we have more than one meaningful opportunity mechanism for people to gain their release.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So thank you for that update. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.